Hello, everyone. I would now like to introduce our next panel session on investing in EV charging infrastructure, both grid and charging. So very good segue from the previous segment into this one. Our moderator for this session is Joachim Brandt. He's the head of electric and autonomous vehicles at Gemserv. With over 25 years of research and industry experience in telecom and energy, Joachim joined Gemserv leading on smart energy and electric vehicles. He previously led on complex innovation projects across the e-mobility and smart energy space for E.ON, chairing the Energy UK EV Working Group and supporting technical standards development. Welcome, Joachim, and over to you.
Hello, and good afternoon. What a great session so far. So I hope you all enjoyed today's conference. Before I swing our panel into action, let me quickly set the scene for the panel discussion. There's no doubt that fossil fuel vehicles will eventually be phased out. I think that is a decision that has been made. But the transition to electric vehicles is challenging, not just in terms of the new vehicle technologies that is yet to come, but also in the provision of commercial viable infrastructure that works for everyone, with emphasis on everyone. We are about a decade into the EV journey so far, and the uptake of electric vehicles, well, there hasn't been much uptake of electric vehicles. 99% of the UK vehicle park still being powered by petrol and diesel. That is really quite frustrating because I think everybody agrees that we have to do more about improving our air quality, and the time for climate change is ticking. Today we have an all-public infrastructure for fossil fuel vehicles that works very well. A relatively low number of petrol stations. In the UK we have in the order of 8,000 plus petrol stations, providing the national travel demand of over 350 billion vehicle miles in the UK we travel every year. High utilization of infrastructure assets with an easy consumer choice of petrol or diesel. As we migrate to electric vehicles, we now have many more options as to how to refuel or charge our vehicles and how to pay for it. Destination charging at home, at work, on street, AC or DC, slow or rapid. Wireless charging works in all locations, in all weathers for all vehicles. Pantographs, battery swap stations. You want to have 500 miles of range in 5 minutes? Absolutely possible with battery swap stations. Or even charge while you drive. There's much uncertainty what will supply electricity to 35 million vehicles in the UK that perhaps in the not too far future will be able to drive autonomously. With larger and larger batteries on wheels, EVs are earmarked to play an integral role in the electricity system for the provision of storage and flexibility, as we strive to increase the use of renewable generation. A portable power bank, so to say, geographically distributed across the UK. But I think who owns the battery in the vehicle? Well, that's not necessarily the consumer. That could be someone else. So, having set the scene, I will ask our esteemed panel to do a 60-second intro to their organization, starting with Toby Butler from Shell.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. So my name's Toby Butler. So I work in Shell Retail, which is the part of Shell that looks after all of the network of service stations. I'm focused in Europe, and my real mission there is in expanding the rapid charging network for, if you like, out-of-home charging. But that is also linked to a wider picture in Shell, which is home charging, energy trading, power generation, etc. So the full integrated power value chain and understanding how that can accelerate the EV adoption.
Thank you, Toby. Toddington Harper from GRIDSERVE.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me to participate. I'm the CEO of GRIDSERVE. Our purpose is to deliver sustainable energy to such a magnitude that we can really move the needle on climate change. What does that mean? It means we've got 7.5 years to prevent 1.5 degrees of warming happening, or 25 years to prevent 2 degrees. So collectively, I guess it's up to us collectively to do something about it, or we won't have a chance. And we kind of summarize that under the kind of overall phrase of we need to #deliver. And I would love it if other people would also do the same. Of which sustainable transport is clearly very important. From our perspective, that involves both creating the renewable energy capacity to provide the energy for that transport, as well as the infrastructure itself to charge. The reason I've got this picture behind me is this is a solar project we built last year in 5 months. It produces enough energy to drive provide all of the energy needs for 20,000 electric vehicles annually. And the highest generation day this year produced enough energy to drive 55 electric vehicles around the world. And it's in Yorkshire, for anybody who says it's not possible to do that in the UK. In the context of electric vehicle charging, first thing to note is I've been a driver for 7 years. Apologies, Joachim, if I'm more than 67, but 60 seconds. And whilst I've enjoyed the challenge of how to navigate the full extent of this country in an electric vehicle, it's been fair to say it's been extremely inconvenient and not something that the mass market would put up with. So in terms of how we enable the mass market, which I guess is what this is really all about, in our opinion, we believe we need to remove any of the inconvenience, need to remove anything associated with range or charging anxiety, and present that with something that's fundamentally better than petrol or diesel cars across the spectrum. We think, as well as everyone has agreed, I think, in this forum, that that's a combination of solutions: home chargers, destination chargers, and of course public chargers. And we as GRIDSERVE are involved in all of these. I guess the thing that we're quite excited about is next month we are launching our first electric forecourt. This is focused on the public charging piece of it. It's close to Braintree in Essex, supported by Innovate UK and OLEV. Thank you very much for that. There's 36 chargers, of which 30 are high power, up to 350 megawatts, 5 megawatt grid connection, which can supply 20,000 miles of charge an hour, and a 6 megawatt hour battery, which can store enough energy to drive 24,000 miles in an EV. So we can store wind at night as well as solar in the day. We've got 200 kilowatt peak of solar on site that can take an EV around 800,000 miles in a year. But of course, that's not enough. And so we twin this with a solar farm that we also own about 44 miles as the crow would fly up the road, which produces around 10 gigawatt hours of energy, which is enough for around 5,000 miles of full energy requirements for 5,000 EVs over the course of a year. And it also has a 6 megawatt hour battery. The combination of the two means that when we launch the site, we will be delivering both zero carbon in terms of the energy we're generating on site and net zero carbon for all of the charging that we're doing, and that's from 2020 onwards. As well as charging vehicles, we also cater for the needs of EV drivers. As a retail building, we've got cracking partners like WH Smith, Costa Coffee, Booths, Post Office, Gourmet, and many others. We also have an upstairs, which we call the G Lounge. It's designed to be a really fantastic place for people to charge while their vehicles are charging, to recharge people batteries, if it like. We've got meeting spaces, meeting rooms, high-end toilets, super fast internet. And really, the place also doubles up as a platform to educate people to learn all about electric vehicles. And we hope really give people the confidence to make the transition in the earliest timeframes. So really excited to be here talking with you. And one thing I really hope people could take from what I'm saying is if we can kind of use the concept of #deliver, because that's really all that needs to be done now.
Thanks, Toddington. And Phil Hack from the Electric Vehicle Network.
Hi, and good afternoon again. Thank you for the invitation. Delivery, I guess, Toddington was the word you used a few times there. So my experience, I've 33 years designing, building and managing electricity infrastructure on the distribution network side. So those 31 of those years were with UK Power Networks, you'll be familiar with. So the last few years I've been working for the EV Network, where I am the managing director. We are a developer and investor in primarily high power charging, so effectively 150 kilowatts plus. So we identify the sites, and we've evaluated over 1,600 sites across the UK. We've submitted over 400 applications to the DNOs, including my old firm, typically for 1 MVA of capacity to build charging hubs. So we identify the site, we then fund the grid connection ourselves, we then fund the construction of the on-site assets, and in effect lease those built assets to charge point operators, utilities and oil companies. So that's what we do, and we recently secured £200 million of investment to take that business forward.
Excellent, thanks a lot, Phil. So to break the ice, over 99% of cars in the UK are still diesel and petrol. Toby, what does Shell think of a ban on sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2035? Are customers ready? Are fuel companies ready? Are the car makers ready?
What a great question, Joachim, to kick this off. So I think there's a few different questions in there. So the ban and then the readiness of all of the different elements to come together. So first with the ban, I think sometimes people find it surprising, but hopefully surprising in a positive way, that recently Shell gave its full support to bringing the ban of internal combustion engine vehicles forward to 2030. I think this is it's a real positive sign of just how committed we are. But it did come with a big caveat that if you put a ban in place, you need a plan. Maybe I will just zoom out to the broader context of just a bit of the so why Shell, known for, like you said, all of that infrastructure for petrol and diesel cars, why are we then supporting this ban, bring forward the ban to 2030? From our side, when you look across all of the different industries and sectors that need to decarbonize over the coming decades to meet the climate goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, which Shell is in full support of, you see that actually transport, and especially light passenger vehicle transport, is actually one of the sectors that we do have the technology to decarbonize, and we know how to do it. Goes back, Toddington, to your delivery point of view. But there are other sectors, aviation, industry, other areas that we don't have all of the technology, are very difficult. So where we do have this sector, where we do have this chance to decarbonize, where we do know the route to do that, we believe we should accelerate towards that goal. And that 2030, although it is a very ambitious date, it is great because if we have that ban, if we have a plan underneath that, and I'll come to that in a second, we have the critical element, which is certainty. Because if you're investing in infrastructure, any certainty you can have about the pace of change allows you then to invest up front and take a more calculated risk, which is, what we're all doing. So coming to the plan, if you like, behind the ban, the ban is useless unless there's a plan. And this comes to the readiness you asked about customers, about fuel companies and infrastructure companies like ourselves, about car makers. I feel in terms of readiness, there are some consumers that are ready for this. I would say the majority aren't. We did a study recently showing that even though 70% of consumers are considering buying an EV, of those 70%, around 80% think the price is way too high. That's the number one issue. Secondary is the whole range anxiety. So, I feel the government, we really need that plan of policy to ensure that there are long-term incentives to help buyers move to EVs. And of course, the OEMs have a massive task of scaling up the technology and the manufacture of these vehicles. I think in terms then of fuel and infrastructure companies, we are investing up front. So we had a target of 200 high-powered charge points to be put in place in the UK by the end of this year. We're going to need a few more months to reach that because of the turmoil of this year. But we're putting infrastructure in the ground. Those are all in our fuel stations. And we're moving as fast as possible. And we're, like many others, we're going to high-powered chargers only now. But we are part of the infrastructure picture. We also want to link that, like I say, to home charging, to destination charging. So I would say we are definitely getting ready, but we all know that the infrastructure is not there at the scale needed right now. And then, so I think we've covered customers, infrastructure companies, car makers. I think the one missing thing is going back to the plan is when it comes to government and policy, like I said, we need incentives on the consumer side. And we also need for any companies like ourselves putting in the infrastructure, we need as much support and clarity and speed we can get over some of those infrastructure changes, of which grid connections and grid upgrades are a key element, which we find now, take too long, can be extremely costly. We need to find a more efficient way of tackling that. So in summary, I would say not one of these elements is perfectly ready, but I do see a huge amount of activity in getting ready. And I think if we can understand the definite date of the phase out of internal combustion engines, then all of our plans of getting ready suddenly become a lot more real, a lot more actionable and time bound, which I think will help us all.
Thank you, Toby. One of the important things, of course, is to end up with a charging infrastructure that is commercially viable. And we have a fixed market of 350 billion vehicle miles in the UK. That's the addressable market, sales of electric miles. But the system or the setup is completely different. So if we assume that maybe 60% of that market is picked up by residential charging and maybe another 30% is picked up by workplace charging, then is 10% of the market left over for public charging enough to be commercially viable? Toddington from GRIDSERVE.
Yeah, hi, Joachim. I mean, that's an interesting question. I think in order to really answer it, I think there's quite a lot of assumptions in there, and it's really important to kind of dig into the detail of what's behind that. So 350 billion miles, I think they slightly rounded down from, I think the estimate of the government last year was 356 billion miles, of which the vast majority were cars. So 287 billion miles was cars and around 55 million light vans. So if you include both cars and light vans, of that 350, around 343 is cars and vans. So that's quite useful, because if you assume that roughly 4 miles per kilowatt hour, that will translate to around 85 billion kilowatt hours, or to put it in an easier way to understand, around 85 terawatt hours of energy. And so if you look at how much energy the kind of domestic sector used at the same period, of the 323 terawatt hours that was generated across the UK, around 103, nearly 104 was supplied into the domestic sector. So if we're talking about really providing that much energy from the domestic sector, we're talking about adding, theoretically, as much as, as much as 85 terawatt hours to, on top of the 103 terawatt hours. And it doesn't really take Einstein to kind of work out that that's going to be extremely challenging. Even if you add smart charging, even if you add shifting, even if you add a combination of different solutions, and that's before you also start saying, well, actually, is it just about electric vehicles, or what about heat pumps? And heat pumps are an alternative, a very electricity hungry alternative to gas boilers. So it's a real challenge in the context of what that challenge would entail. One of the really interesting references that we found was National Grid, who produced a report called Forecourt Thoughts, who estimated that it would require replacing over 300,000 low voltage circuits to physically upgrade the grid to enable that 60% of homes that theoretically could charge at home. So I think it's, who knows what 300,000 low voltage circuits would cost. Presumably it's multiple billions and would take a lot of time. I think it's important to kind of recognize that whilst home charging is incredibly important, and we, as I said, are certainly behind it and involved in that area as well, it's for sure not the panacea. Just because you have the potential ability to charge at home because you've got a driveway that's off street doesn't mean you physically can. And the grid will really struggle when we get to these sorts of numbers. In addition to even notwithstanding all of the efforts that we can take. But of course, everybody doesn't have the ability to charge at home. There's around 30 to 40% of people who practically can't. That's a lot of people. And I'm not sure those people would also want to pay for the many billions or whatever the cost would be of upgrading the grid for people who could. So it isn't a panacea. It is difficult. I would also question that workplace charging is an alternative to home charging. Would you be happy buying an electric car if you were able to charge at work but not at home? Question mark. So I'm not really sure it's an either or. I think it's a simplification of that, of the reality. Again, I come back to what where we're coming from, that, and also reiterating what other people have said, that a range of solutions are needed. These need to be matched to the location. Home chargers where possible, smart chargers absolutely where possible. You also need to deal with multiple chargers per household, and that adds power requirements in addition to energy requirements, which are two related but different considerations. So in addition to home charging, in addition to workplace charging, which has many of the same considerations and issues about low voltage circuits that home charging does, then of course you really need really good and also really affordable, echoing Toby's point, charging infrastructure. We need to put the economics of electric vehicles in favor to customers. If these solutions cost more than petrol or diesel, there's going to be less uptake. And actually our view is that if you finance vehicles, they're taking board a much lower operating cost, which absorbs spreads the higher capex over time, which won't be higher for much longer, then you can actually get these vehicles at a lower cost. So affordable public charging infrastructure, not public charging infrastructure that is really expensive. The combination is, it's very clear to us that ultra fast, ultra reliable, high power charging is really an essential part of the mix, and we believe will be for the foreseeable future.
But will 10% of the addressable market be sufficient for affordable public infrastructure? Maybe Toby, you want to come in here to support this?
Yeah, I mean, I would first of all, I would echo Toddington in that I don't think this percentage of a certain amount of charging will be done on the go versus at home. I think when we're looking 5 to 10 years out, I think it's very difficult to predict exactly. I mean, all sorts of organizations have different models on how to predict this. But in Shell, we believe that the on-the-go demand for EV charging infrastructure will, in many cases, be higher than that, actually. And I think it's something that we have to experiment with. I would say anybody who can tell you for sure, look, this is the share available to home, this is the available share to destination, this is the available share to rapid, whatever that is. Clearly no one knows. That's why we need to learn, be flexible, scale up as we see solutions work. So I don't think we should get hung up on predicting exactly what scale of infrastructure is required. I think we should get on with making the big, bold first steps, learn, and then adjust as we go. That's the approach we're taking.
So I think the common theme here is we still have to learn in terms of what it is going to be in the future. Let me bring in Phil at this point with a slightly different question. On average, people travel less than 25 miles per day. The electricity demand, in Toddington was already doing some of the number crunching here, is something in the order of 5 kilowatt hours per day per car, or in money terms, it's £1 per day per car. Is there a need for millions of 7 kilowatt domestic chargers that have a utilization of less than 5%?
Okay, I think we've probably all got things at home that have a utilization of less than 5%. But the problem with, I guess, with averages, I was just looking at the cars. We've got 3 vehicles in our household. We've got one that does 400 miles a week, one that does 100 miles a week, and one that does 10 miles a week. So actually, whilst an average may be a lot lower than the 400 miles a week, obviously it's likely that at least one of those cars will need high power charging regularly. If you're doing 400 miles a week, probably a couple of times a week, 3 times a week, possibly, depending on the journey. So that's a slight problem with averages. A long time ago, I used to design electricity networks for housing estates. And I live not far from a few of them, and I drive around them. And when we used to design, and they still do now, although things are changing, we used to allow 2 kilowatts per household. That's not on the service cable, so the fuse may be 100 amps, and the service cable may be 100 amp service cable, but the mains cable that connects all the houses together and the substation on the end was designed for 2 kilowatts each. Now, even with a 3 kilowatt charger, never mind a 7 kilowatt charger, when we get into mass adoption, that's a problem. The networks weren't designed, and to retrofit every housing estate, and if you think new build, that's fine, they can design that in, including the heat pumps. But if you looked at retrofitting all those housing estates with digging up every single footpath, literally, and I was reflecting on this, and when did that last happen? It last happened in some places for fibre, and the installation of fibre, one of the biggest civil projects in the UK, installing fibre around the streets. So it's very unlikely, you know, not in the short term. In the short term, fine, every fifth house might have a charge, and that won't really move the needle. But when we get to mass adoption, the home charging, the ability to home charging with smart charging and leveling, and I only charge it every third day, is going to be very, very challenging, very, very difficult for the network to manage. Not to say it's impossible, but I think some people will prefer to have it on their terms and not on the terms of their energy supplier or someone else controlling when they can draw that power. So I think 7 kilowatt chargers everywhere is unlikely. I mean, for us, we focus on high power charging. So we think there's an opportunity, and in these housing estates, I think you can install perhaps a 50 kilowatt charger or 100 kilowatt charger near the substation using that spare capacity. But to think that we're going to end up in a place where every house has got a 7 kilowatt charger, or even less, I think is not going to happen in the longer term. Multiple cars, and I think, you know, we talk a lot about cars because it's exciting. The brands are coming through and looking really, really exciting. But the commercial fleets, the vans, the utility drivers, the delivery drivers running around in 3.5 ton trucks, very rarely do they park on driveways and you know, right next to the house. They are regularly left out on the road, and time is money. So if you're driving a van and you're doing 200 miles or 300 miles, you need to deliver high power charging, because if I'm running a utility fleet and I'm paying those guys an hourly rate, I can't afford for them to be sat somewhere for 3 hours on a 22 kilowatt charger or 50 kilowatt charger. I need to get a lot of power into that vehicle as quickly as possible, and then back on the road, back on the tools, or whatever their role is. So I think I do see charging at home, but not to the extent that I think people might think it's going to be. All early adopters had to have a driveway. Very few early adopters of an EV said, I'm going to buy an EV and I've got no sort of backstop to charge it. That's going to change in the next generation of EV drivers.
Yes, maybe just to expand a little bit on this. I mean, domestic charging, of course, is also related to your house fuse, and a lot of house fuses only have 75 amps. So a 7 kilowatt charger will take a lot of amps out of your house fuse, which is not really feasible for a lot of the domestic.
Yeah, don't have a shout. Yeah, in my patch it was 60 amps or 100 amps, and yeah, you might not want to have an electric shower at the same time as charging your car.
So, but this is posing the question that on the one hand, you potentially are thinking that domestic charging, oh, this is the easy thing, this is a convenient thing, everybody can do this. But in reality, from a network and from a distribution system point of view, actually, that isn't that straightforward.
Yeah, so when any of the people on this panel think about a new charging station, they procure a dedicated high power connection. Could be 1 MVA, it could be 5 or 7 MVA for an electric forecourt. So they procure that, and that's dedicated. That's for them, and it's been designed for them. Yes, there's a cost component, and obviously that is a challenge. But they're not trying to build it on the back of something else. They'll look at and seek sites out where the cost is deliverable and commercially viable. And as I said earlier, we've looked at 1,600 sites and 400 grid applications. And out of the 400 grid applications today, probably 100, 150 are viable now. And as we start to see the uptake, then actually we'll see that move into the 200, the 400, the 1,000 sites. And it's all about managing risk. You know, there's not a lot of money in EV charging today because of the capex investment, but that's going to change. And it's about having the right sites in the right locations, like Toddington's got in Braintree, not far from where I live. I'm really looking forward to going and seeing that site. But that's, I think, what we're going to see. And that will also give drivers the confidence to say, okay, I'm not going to be able to charge at home, but I can now see 2 or 3 charges in my vicinity where I think I can go in and for 150 kilowatt charger for 20 minutes and drink a nice coffee at the same time.
At this point, can I also invite the audience to think of some, let's say, difficult question for our panel to make it more challenging? And while the audience is thinking about it, Let's wind forward a little bit more, taking a future look of this, because at the end of the day, it's planning, isn't it? Planning for investment. Vehicle technology and charging infrastructure are interdependent, and it is hard to invest into charging infrastructure without clarity of the vehicle technology that we will be seeing in the market in the coming years. So there's a lot of dependency on the automakers. And for example, the UK government is consulting on safe use of automated lane keeping systems on motorways right now, which really sort of, the story behind this is to position UK PLC at a pole position for allowing autonomous vehicles on UK roads. Consulting on safe use. Nope, there was something between. So how do we coordinate across industry sectors and government to give some certainty to investors about the choices to invest in? Toby.
So I think there are multiple choices. I think for Shell there are key technology choices, like you say, we need to make on charging infrastructure. There are key choices on what sectors we want to target with that EV charging infrastructure. I don't think there is one silver bullet, one framework that will resolve this all. I think, at least some of the variation in between the automotive manufacturers and, let's say, the charging infrastructure is becoming clearer. So, we see CCS as sort of, a very sort of strong, if you like, standard that I think the OEMs now are focused on, which simplifies our lives. I think that's a good thing. But I think there are other aspects when we look at this sort of long-term decision making in the infrastructure we put in, which we really need some big leaps, I would say, in technology, because it does. There are a lot of questions when we're putting in high-powered chargers. Are they flexible? Can they have a modular approach to being upgraded in the future? I think that's critical for us, because if there is obsolescence that we think is going to come earlier rather than later, it's a big impact on the commercial business case of this infrastructure. And the other angle is on the grid connection. So, there are, working with DNOs, working with IDNOs, there are sort of clever things that can be done in terms of being able to take more capacity in the future, but potentially we need a bit more structure around that, because we all know, for example, we're building a rapid charging hub in London, in central London. So it's going to be an urban hub. It's going to have 10 high-powered chargers, all of the amenities like a cafe and a shop. But we know at some point in the future that the current grid capacity will need to be upgraded. And we would prefer to have some sort of flexible system where we don't have to go for another upgrade in the future, but that flexible system needs to be affordable now. So this is where I think, whether DNO, government, the rest of the industry can work together to figure out how to put in infrastructure which can be upgraded in both a modular but also an affordable way for the future. Because the demand, the great demand, like we all know, it's going to come, 2025, 2030. That's when the real need will be there, and that's when we've got to be ready for it.
I think, Toby, I hear a call for collaboration across the different industry sectors, because we are all in this together. And maybe expanding on this question for Phil. I mean, I'm an EV driver, and the one thing that I always dread is it's raining and I have to plug in and I will get wet hands, and the first thing you're looking for is, where's the tissue so I can clean and dry my hands, and or actually, is it safe if it's wet or if it's icy? And some car manufacturers are actually starting to offer wireless charging solution. Less intrusive in terms of the cityscape, less street furniture, less trip hazard. Is it a barrier that we're not really moving fast enough to making technology choices going forward?
It's a great question. I managed a few years ago to secure some funding to look at wireless charging from, I think it was Innovate UK. So I guess we're focusing on the here and now. So when we think about a site, we have a few choices. We've got the CCS in CHAdeMO. Now we can save a few £1,000s on a high power charger to not bother putting the CHAdeMO on. It might disappoint a few drivers, but so we're looking at that, and we're looking at the cost impact on the investment case, because ultimately we're looking to make an investment. When we secure capacity, and it's a great point that's been made by Toby around this ability to get a decent HV high voltage connection into the site, typically 11,000 volts, could be higher for an electric forecourt. Secure that capacity, but not actually use all that at once, and slowly add transformers behind the meter to give that additional capacity. So that's an option that's available. I guess the challenge is not there's no one on from a DNO, and I guess I've got some history, but the challenge is someone's got to pay for it. And if it's not the user of that energy, who are typically commercial businesses trying to make money, then it's going to be the DNOs themselves, and they're regulated obviously by Ofgem, and they'll end up smearing the cost, and that means you and me as domestic users of electricity will see an uplift because someone out there somewhere wants to do something exciting with electrifying a bus fleet or building an electric forecourt. So it is a bit challenging, and Ofgem need to try and work out how they deliver both sides, the transition that we all want as a society, but also recognise that, you know, my mum's electricity bill is going to go up because of someone wants to make some money out of EV charging. So that's the balance they need to come up with. So in terms of, I think the point around wireless charging, when we put capacity in a site, we put 1, 2 or 3 MVA into a site. Ohm's law has not changed because we've invented electric vehicles. That's the same. So whether we install a wireless charging pad in the tarmac, or whether it's a cable dangled to something called a CCS connector, it sort of doesn't really matter. We're trying to deploy infrastructure today, which means we're building CCS and looking at CHAdeMO as well in chargers today. So I think in 10 years' time, and these high power chargers have got, you know, they are big, hefty pieces of engineering and technology. We'd like to think they've got 10 years asset life on them. In 10 years, we may start swapping, might be more power, or it may be just changing the solutions. We're putting wireless pads instead of these fridges with apologies any manufacturers on the line, but these are these big units with cables hanging off them. So I think we can make investment decisions today based on what we know, and I guess a reasonable assumption on the future. But securing capacity is the first way of reducing any sort of future risk of the wrong sites.
Concern coming from the audience. There seems to be a lot of talk about high power charging, CCS, CHAdeMO, so DC rapid on a regular basis, but the concern is that that has a potentially very negative impact on the battery in the vehicle. So if you charge it every, consistently high power DC, your battery will degrade faster. Your car will essentially reduce in value. And in fact, how do you assess what the state of health is for the battery? So there's a real concern in there. So how do you mitigate for that? Is it something that should be done on the charge point installation side? Is it something that is the responsibility of the vehicle makers? There seems to be somehow a disconnect that we have this sort of chemical process called the battery in the vehicle that doesn't take too kindly for being cooked in the vehicle.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I think I think this kind of concept that high power batteries degrade quicker is one which is going to be resigned to history quite soon. There's many types of batteries. You get, lithium-ion batteries of all sorts of types. There's a type of battery, as an example. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for an electric car, but it's a good illustration. A lithium titanate battery that can charge 20,000 times at, incredibly high power. It doesn't store as much energy. But I think that just kind of illustrates that there are different chemistries. And what's for sure being adopted is manufacturers focusing on batteries that enable you to charge them with extreme high power without such degradation. And if you really wanted to see evidence of that, you'd look at, I guess, at Ionity, which is, owned by the major car companies, only installing 350 kilowatt chargers. So they wouldn't be putting in those chargers exclusively for their, principal network if that wasn't the direction of travel. For any really geeky people like me, and I definitely put myself in that category, then I would encourage people to kind of look at what Tesla announced on Battery Day, where they talked about new innovations, batteries that can take 5 times the power of even the ones today, and the ones today can take 250 kilowatts of power. And so really, it's all about chemistry. It doesn't, the batteries that people have been putting in cars have been ones that have had a trade-off between power and energy storage, i.e. the higher energy storage ones you couldn't charge with as much power. And because people didn't have enough charging infrastructure, people were more concerned of how far the car would go before you ran out of energy. When we move into a world of more than enough charging infrastructure, people will be much more concerned with how quickly you charge them. And if you look at the direction of travel, plus talk to the battery manufacturers, which we do extensively, it's very clear that the new generation of batteries, which are already going into vehicles, and there's a lot more to come, can be charged at very high power, very long durations, without experiencing significant degradation.
There's a lot of ifs in there, I think, and not sure whether this will be convincing to the audience, because obviously there's a lot of articles in the news, for example, that people were driving on the motorway, and even though their vehicle is fast rapid charging enabled, but actually the vehicle decided to charge much slower because the battery was still hot. So it really screams out that there needs to be coordination between the infrastructure providers and the car makers to really have clarity how this is going to go forward.
If I may, Joachim, come back on that, then there's a difference between battery degradation, which is your cell, and the battery BMS, the management system, which would be responsible if it's too hot. When your car charges, it's actually your car BMS that determines how much power it will accept, and that's specifically so it doesn't have degradation in the batteries. And what I was talking about is new cells that are coming online, which are being used now, which BMS will allow higher power into them because the cells don't degrade as much. And again, I don't think there really are very many ifs and buts anymore. Again, look at Ionity. Would they really be putting in chargers that degrade their batteries? I think the answer to that is pretty clear.
And I think just to extend on that point, we are building infrastructure. We're not building infrastructure to last 5 minutes. We're building infrastructure to last 20, 30, 40 years. Some of the assets we put in the ground are 40-year assets. Okay, the chargers aren't 40-year assets, more like a 10-year asset. So what we can't afford to do is put a load of chargers that are perhaps 50s and think, okay, that's fine because it keeps the battery safe. We want to put the highest, the 350 kilowatts chargers that are now out in the market. A number of manufacturers are providing those, because as the battery, there's billions of pounds being invested by the motor manufacturers in this technology, and they're learning all the time. And they're going to, I know, and I can see that in year 7 or year 8, people will be shopping around and going, where's that 350 again? Because I know I can jump on that and I'm 15 minutes and I'm away. If we put technology now and then have to swap it out, that's just more cost and effectively more risk for us. So yes, we pay a bit more now, but we know that those high power destinations are where people are going to hunt out, like they were hunting out the 22s over the 11s and the 50s over the 22 kilowatts, and they'll be hunting out the 350s or the 175 kilowatts over the 50s because they know their car can take it and they want to be charged and they want to get on with their lives.
I think the audience is warming up. Wireless charging. I think at the moment there's a perception that wireless charging is really slow. And again, it needs a lot of coordination between the car makers and the infrastructure providers, because again, which horse are you going to back? Which infrastructure you're going to deploy? Which one is the one that is going to scale up? What's your view on wireless charging? Toby.
So I mean, where we see the most obvious application is in the slower speeds of charging now, and that's for the domestic, for maybe for the consumer use, and potentially for taxi fleets or other fleets that are doing certain circuits and are going to use infrastructure at sort of at the right regular intervals on that wireless charging. There's a great application. So we're really interested in it. Through New Motion that supplies tens of thousands of home and work AC charging points throughout Europe, we're looking into that technology, and we definitely think it has a place in the future. But I suppose it does go back to Phil's point, which is we are of course interested in and have to be looking at R&D and future developments and coordination. But for now, for the delivery, what is going to make the difference is that decent backbone of rapid charging infrastructure and then the various other flavors of charging that you need. So I would say I'm sure it has a future. There are a couple of applications where, yes, we consider it very strong, but it's not clear yet that kind of all cable-based charging can switch to wireless in X year. That's sort of still wishful thinking, but let's see what happens.
Okay, let's see what happens. I mean, similar question along those lines. Scalability is key to drive UK GDP and unlock global opportunities backed by UK net zero commitment. So, I mean, that is a question to all of the panelists. Which technology would you nominate that scales best from a national perspective? Phil, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's one technology. I think it's the obvious cop-out answer, actually. Our business is focused on capacity, securing capacity, and putting chargers that we think are going to be used today and over the next 10 years. That's how we manage. That's how we manage risk. So, I've been listening to all the other sessions today, and I'm sure it'll be similar tomorrow. People will charge at home. They'll be snacking. They'll drop into a Burger King and have a top up there, and then they'll go to a petrol filling station type environment and get that high power charge, and perhaps at work. So I don't think there's anyone, oh, this is the right answer, let's pile in. Our business is very much focused on a particular use case, which is en route charging plus destination. And when I talk about destination, we're talking about car parks, but not just car parks long dwell times, car parks with a charging hub. So in effect, we're changing the idea of going to a car park not to park, but actually using it as a charging hub. So for us securing the right locations, if it's my money, and we have this conversation regularly, if it was your money, what would you do with it? We would be, and I know sites across the UK where I'd literally put my mortgage and go, if it's going to work anywhere, it's going to work there, because 1,000 kVA is, 1,000 kVA capacity is 50 grand, and there's 104,000 vehicle movements every day. So if it's going to work, it's going to work there first. So it still might take a couple of years to be positive, but I know in 10 years time I'll be going, oh my God, I can now buy 10 houses, not perhaps the one I bought I put my mortgage on. So for us, capacity in the right locations, and then be efficient and deliver safely, and obviously there's any money we spend now in delivering a project, that's got to be paid back over the next 20 years. So it needs to be really well thought through and planned.
Yeah, at 1% of penetration of electric vehicles, 99% are still fossil fuel. Toby, which technology do you think the consumer will back?
Well, in terms of, I think for passenger cars, I think it's obvious, isn't it? We all think EV has a massive role to play. I still think, and there's multi-pronged solutions. So we can't forget about the number of gasoline and diesel cars on the road. Anything we can do to make them more efficient, whether that is through changes of engine technology, the lubrication, the fluids that goes in the engines, the clean fuels that can be used, any incremental benefits are important, because that base is massive. I think EV, clearly for passenger cars, but then we believe that hydrogen has a major role to play for heavy duty transport, for trains, for other applications, and that it would be a real mistake to kind of get totally focused only on electric, if you like, without seeing that different applications, different sectors will require different solutions, and that we should all give them room to compete and not try to pick the winning solution for every sector, every application too early on. Let the market develop and see what the best solution for the customer is.
Can I just add to that? In terms of scalability, I just sort of change the words around a little bit and talk about getting to scale. And we're talking about potentially getting to 20 to 30 million electric vehicles within the next 20 odd years, and that's really something. But the government, I think, is doing an incredible job of defining the that this is the direction of travel, but it's ultimately consumers who's going to decide how quickly we get there, and that will be determined by how quickly people want to get there, how quickly they want to make the transition. So I think if we can collectively keep working on putting the odds in favour of electric cars and just making, giving people absolutely no reason whatsoever why they wouldn't get an electric vehicle and a ton of reasons why they should, then I think that's really what's going to achieve scale and scalability on the earliest possible timeframes.
Okay, I can see Natasha, so let me bring this to a close with a final question to all of you, which I hope you can answer in a succinct and single sentence answer. As business is committed to the transition of electric vehicles, delivering a better future for everyone, what is your top priority ask from the UK government? Toddington.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so I think the government often gets a lot of bashing just generally, but certainly that's not what I would say at all in this context. I think the government's doing an absolutely brilliant job. I think we're all extremely grateful. 4 years ago, when I set about trying to do what we're doing now, it was incredibly different investment environment to what it is today, and materially that is down to the clear position the government has taken. So I'm very grateful for that. We as an industry are. If I could ask for one kind of ask, is just to continue to provide even more clarity. Like Toby said, a specific date would be really helpful to us, for us to put the plans around achieving that date. If I could be very cheeky and have one slight additional ask, it would be that the government simplify messaging even further and embrace the mantra both now and into COP26 that this is all about #deliver, make it happen, put the UK at the forefront. So
simplicity and clarity. Phil, what's on your top of the wish list?
So I think there are obviously a number of incentives, benefit in kind being one for company car drivers. I think what we need is a base load. To invest, we don't have to have 1,000 cars a day turning up at a charging station. Yes, we'd love that, but we don't need that today. We need a base load of vehicles, and if through working with government in terms of providing incentives for van drivers, particularly because in a lot of cases they will be using this public fleet, infrastructure. So perhaps incentives around commercial vehicles, small vans converting may be really interesting because they're on the road, they've got to do the mileage, they can't work from home because their job is driving a van for some reason. And I think that could actually really be a good stimulus to those organisations who are trying to build out a public high power charging. Make sure the vans can take a high power charge, by the way. It's no good them deploying stuff that can charge at 50 kilowatts. We want vans that can take 150 kilowatts plus, but some incentives to get those dirty white vans off the road for the utilities and van drivers. And actually, I think there'll be a really strong signal, because I think same as in London, when people see electric buses driving around, they go, wow, that bus drives around all day and it's a double decker. Who knew that? They'll give them a bit of confidence, say, you know what, I'm going to have a look and see if I'm ready to make that transition.
Excellent. And Toby, if government would grant you one wish, what would you ask for?
I think it's got to be 100% clarity on the date of the phase out, the ban of ICE vehicles, but with that, a really strong plan. And I think, like we said, two main elements to that plan. One is continued support to allow consumers to make the move onto EV vehicles, and the other is for companies, like ourselves, where we're building out that infrastructure. How do we do that, and how do governments and other bodies help us do that faster, lower cost, in an accelerated way?
And with that, many thanks to the panel, and back to Natasha.
Thank you, Toby, Phil, Toddington, and Joachim for a very engaging panel discussion, and actually one that we finally sort of got a little bit into the technical elements of that high-speed charging with some pretty good numbers there, Toddington. So thank you so much, all of you, for your inputs and your discussion. We will now pause the live stream for just a few seconds as we prepare for our final speaker session of the day. So please stay tuned, and we'll be right back in a few seconds.